I'm here with Susie Taylor. Susie lives in Harbor Grace, Newfoundland. She is the author of two books. Her first was a novel called Even Weirder Than Before. Even Weirder Than Before was a queer coming of age debut that explored the nature of family, friendships, and sexual awakenings. Her most recent book is called Vigil, published with Breakwater Books in May, just 4 short months ago. I had the pleasure of hearing Susie read in August at the Writers at Woody Point Writers Festival, and I enjoyed listening to her so much that I invited her to do a podcast interview with me instead of my usual text interview. Thank you, Susie, for joining me.
Well, thank you for inviting me.
Vigil is a collection of short stories. These are linked stories. They all deal with a common cast of characters in the fictional town of Bay-Melverde, Newfoundland, a town that's in the middle of a drug crisis. The stories also relate one way or another to the death of a young man named Stevie. Susie, your publication track, I think, is in reverse to what we often see in CanLit. The traditional route is when we see a new writer release a collection of short stories. They wait, hope for it to be well received, build a bit of a readership, then follow that up with a novel. But you put a novel out there first, then followed that up with a collection of short stories. Why did you choose to write this collection? Or why did you choose to write this book as a collection of linked stories as opposed to, say, another novel?
It's interesting because I have been asked this question several times, and I think that I've answered it in different ways. And I've been thinking a lot about it. And in some ways, it wasn't a choice so much as part of the process of writing. I wrote the novel, and when I started writing, I was just in isolation. I wasn't in school. I had no idea what I was doing. I'd read a lot, but I hadn't taken any writing courses. And when it became evident that I was, trying to establish a career, that this just, wasn't a pipe dream, that there was actually a possibility I might get published, I realized one of the ways to do that from the outside was to start writing short stories and submitting to competitions and submitting to journals. And so after I had written my novel, I started just plugging away at short stories in between. And so I had these stories, and I didn't initially even intend to be writing about Newfoundland, but I've lived here for 22 years and I've lived in Harbor Grace for 16 years. And I had this idea, I wanted to write stories like, edgy urban stories like the ones that I love to read. But in fact, that is not my life. And I don't know anything about that. And so what happened is I was writing more and more about Harbor Grace and my experiences of living here and, the things I would think about when I was walking through my neighborhood. And although they ended up becoming a linked collection, when I was writing them and they were getting published, like there was no the time frame was all over the place. I was writing in first person. I was writing, you know, um, in third. I was like switching things up. It wasn't like there was no overarching rules to the way I was writing it. It was just these stories were happening. And then eventually I realized that I had like Stevie just kept popping up. He was everywhere. I felt like he was popping up in my imagination, adding these stories. And I would suddenly reread something I would written. I would be like, oh, that's Stevie. Like that's Stevie under another name, or this is Stevie here. This is Stevie in the woods.
Stevie everywhere.
Stevie everywhere.
Um, so Stevie's tragedy is really at the heart of this collection. But it's really linked directly also to the town and the tragedy of the town and what the town is going through kind of at the same time. They're linked through this growing drug epidemic and the drug-related deaths in the area. Why was this relationship so important to you, and why did you choose to focus on that and draw it out, and it becomes a bit of a centerpiece, I think, to the collection?
I think that when we think about addiction, when we think even about things like food deserts, places where people don't have access to a lot of fresh food, when we think about places that people don't have access to education, we often think of that as being like urban problems, things centered in urban areas, even homelessness. Like homelessness, being unhomed looks very different in a rural area where you might be couch surfing or sleeping in a car rather than sleeping on the sidewalk. But we have all these problems. And in some ways, they're expounded because when you live somewhere that's small, like there is no transit in Harbor Grace. There's no way to get out. Like if you're here and you don't have the advantage of being incredibly gifted, so you can claw your own way out through education, or if your parents don't have advantages, it is very difficult to change your life, like to change your lot in life, to change your opportunities. And so many things have happened in rural Newfoundland since I've been living here. Um, there was two businesses have closed in Harbor Grace. We used to have a grocery store, it closed. And as all these things have happened, the rise in addiction has gotten worse and worse. And the nature of addiction has also changed. So what used to be, mostly Oxycontin bottles that you would see lying around, a lot of empty liquor bottles in the streets, it has changed into this far more dangerous, I mean, not that that wasn't dangerous, but with the rise of fentanyl, it has just become such a dangerous place. So it's the risks involved in the drug trade are increasing, the risks involved in addiction are increasing, but the ways out are so few when you live somewhere that's so isolated.
And the lack of resources, all of that.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, and even I often say, like, if you're a young girl who becomes pregnant in a
Mhm.
small town like Bay Melverde, like Harbor Grace, you can't even go to the drugstore here without being recognized. You can't buy a pregnancy test when being recognized. You walk into the local clinic for a doctor's appointment, everyone sitting in that room knows who you are. How do you get to town to have an abortion? Like, how does that happen? It's so hard um, to access resources and to access resources privately too, which is another big thing because, you know, if you want to discuss your addictions, et cetera, it's much easier to do that when, there is a real sense of anonymity there.
Um, and I think you're really showing a side of rural living we don't always see in the literature. And it's very real. But you live also in Harbor Grace, and you're not shy about the fact that this is quite similar to the fictional town of Bay Melverde. And you've said already right from the get-go, you were inspired by writing about where you live. Um, and I can kind of, and even in the story, in the collection, you mentioned the running girl, which kind of becomes the narrator of the book. How do you find a balance between writing about a place so honestly, almost ruthlessly, where you also live? Do you find this difficult finding that balance?
I would say it's something I think about a lot. I can say in absolute honesty that there are things that I have witnessed that have happened in my neighborhood that are far more shocking than anything that happens in the book that I will not write about because um, I really don't want to I don't want to use people that I know in that way. I don't want to be the person that's like taking people's real lives and fictionalizing them because I think that that's not the right thing to do. Part of the reason I placed myself in there is because I'm a CFA. I remember what it was like when the shipping news came back out and there was all the pushback against Annie Prue. Um,
Those seal flipper burgers, I remember those.
yeah. And there was, I think it was a squid burger too. There was like various things, right? Like,
All the
and
burgers.
I've seen it even more recently when people who maybe have a summer home here write about here, and you will hear Newfoundland writers saying, "Who do they think they are?" They don't know what it's like. Um, but also that character called Susie, who is sort of like messy me, I always think, is culpable too. Like there are things that that character does that are like complicit with the crime in the neighborhood. There are choices that that character makes that are not the choices we think of as necessarily being the best moral choices. Like, and I think that character too represents something that I think about a lot. That it's really easy to vilify, I mean, particularly Kev, as being like the real bad guy. But what would you do if you were born in the same place and your economic options were like working at McDonald's for minimum wage, and never getting ahead, like never having anything, being treated badly, or if your option was becoming a drug dealer and actually having some quality of life, actually being able to support your families. Like, we look at people who do terrible, violent things, and it's easy to say, oh, that's so awful. But, Big Pharma is also doing terrible, awful things, and med suits are equally culpable in the deaths of so many people.
Right. Blaming the person instead of the system that
Yeah.
they're stuck in.
Yeah.
In the town, I thought you made really fantastic use of these unexpected and nuanced locations, like the dumpster that Stevie gets stuck inside, for example, the hearse that gets hotboxed. And I could kind of picture you out for a run and running past the dumpster and have this moment where you're like, I need to put a story in there. Um, and where do your stories begin, or where do these little locations come into play? Do you start with a character or an idea or one of these, choice and very specific locations in the town?
It's funny. I was thinking about that. And it's kind of a terrifying question because, like, where do stories come from? Like, who knows? If I knew that. Um, I think that they do. I mean, writing is hard work, and a lot of it is sitting in front of the computer. But a lot of my ideas do come when I'm out running or walking. We had major construction on the road beside us last summer, and one of the things that happened is they actually put a porta potty directly in front of our house, and it actually our kitchen window is up above it, and then we're looking down right into this porta potty where the constructions workers were coming goods.
What a
But the
view.
neighborhood kids, this was like the best thing that ever happened to them, and they spent a ton of time like doing bad things to the porta potty, and I spent a ton of time yelling at these kids with limited effect sometimes.
Leave
So I
that
guess,
porta potty alone.
yeah, exactly. Hey, you. I like to yell from behind the fence so I sound bigger. But I think it's moments like that 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 those details come from.
Do you find that you approach writing short stories? Sorry. Do you find writing your second book, not so much just that it was short stories, but that it was your second project? Did you feel like you approached that in a very different way than you did when you first tackled your first book, which is a novel, which is a Goliath project? Was your approach different the second time?
So when I wrote Even Weirder Than Before, I had no idea what I was doing. I had like no outside influences. Like I was just me in Harbor Grace trying to write this novel. And there was an incredible and wonderful freedom of doing that without, I wasn't thinking about perspective. I wasn't thinking about I had no language of craft. I wasn't presenting to a writer's group. I was incredibly ignorant about even people talk about things like arc and this was like nowhere on my radar. I just sat every day and the words came out and then, I would go back and look up grammar rules because I was pretty bad at it. Um, but writing this book, things had changed because the expectations had changed. And I don't have a formal education, but I have been in some workshops and I was in a really great writing group where I learned a lot, but it was also really stressful because sometimes I was like, I don't know, people be saying things and I'd be like, I have never thought about that. Like I was just,
What does this mean?
what do you mean? Like I'd be like writing things down. I still have to do that. I'm like, what does this mean? What does exposition mean? What is that? Like, so in some ways, this book was more challenging because I had like I knew that there were all these tools and things that people were talking about, and I didn't necessarily always know what they were. Um, so it was a completely different experience. And it was also very different knowing that you have a shot of something getting published
Mhm.
than writing something and it just all seeming so like nobody knew who I was. Like when I won the Fresh Fish Award, like I read to a room of total strangers. And in some ways there's an incredible freedom to that that I miss. Um, but having said that, I also know that my writing is a lot stronger from like having intellectual relationships with other writers, exchanging work with other writers, getting feedback. Um, Carmela Gray Cosgrove has read every one of these stories, and I've worked on this for a long time. But there's an incredibly gratifying thing about like having dinner with Carmela and my partner Colleen, and they're having arguments about Kev. Like they're telling me things, and I'm like, he's not yours, like he's mine. But they have like really definite opinions about, what should happen. And that was a big difference too, is like sort of having other people's input
Raising the
into,
bar.
yeah,
Raising the
yeah,
bar, raising the expectation, while at the same time gathering these tools into your toolbox. It's a lot, all at
yeah.
um, do you write every day, or do you think that is an absurd idea?
Um, I think that people that write every day don't have to do anything else. I think they must be like independently wealthy and have trust funds, and they're not cleaning their house, and they're not washing their underwear, and they're not cleaning the litter box, and they're having some kind of idealized, self-centered, narcissistic world where they don't actually have to like do any emotional care for anyone or anything else in the universe.
Are these people even real?
I don't know. And do we like them? I
Do we
guess.
like them?
Um, so I absolutely do not do that. Like for instance, we just got 10 truckloads of wood delivered.
Mhm.
And like we need that wood to keep warm in the winter. But the only way that wood is gonna get stacked is when I do it. And I cannot sit at the typewriter and stack the wood simultaneously. But having said that, I might not be putting my pen to paper, but I will be thinking about my writing when I'm stacking that wood. And I might like have to run upstairs and write something on a post-it note and stick it somewhere in the house so that I remember that moment. And hopefully we'll be able to meet my handwriting at a later date.
You're ahead of us. We're still waiting on our wood because our wood delivery guy, and that's his name in our phone, wood delivery guy,
Yeah.
doesn't have any this year because the winter was so mild that he didn't really bother to go out and get more than he needed for himself. So, climate change, it impacts us all over the place.
Yes.
So what's next for Susie Taylor? Is it too soon to ask? Do you need more time to squirrel away into a room behind a closed door before you commit to anything? But I am curious.
Um, I am writing what I think will be like a more traditional novel. So I can stop asking questions about whether it's a short story collection or not. Um, but it's still early. I'm actually tomorrow I'm going to Huddy Hunk Island for a workshop with the American writer Lauren Walk, and I'm gonna workshop the first chapter of that and see how that goes. And
Can I ask you to repeat the name of that island? What was it you said?
it's Cutty Hunk,
Oh, I I just heard Punk
CTTYHUNK.
Island, and I was like, "Oh, is this a new? Will this be aired? Will this be?
So
Is this a reality show?"
yeah, I felt it might be like that. Like, who knows what I'll be writing about after that. So
Fantastic. Well, good luck with it. And thanks for taking the time to do this interview with me for the Artisanal Writer. And I look forward to whatever you do next.